I'm looking for additional ideas about how to build our board as a team. We've worked hard to develop a really strong board, and I'm contemplating arranging some team development. We currently meet every other month remotely since people are spread throughout the US. Any recommendations?
Have an in-person retreat. So I think that this is underestimated, and I don't think enough organizations do it. But when you do an annual in-person retreat, and I realize this costs money, right? Like you've got people across the country, so this is going to be an investment. But if you have the money and can budget for it, please do it. And I probably sound old-fashioned or old school. It is very rare that I think you can create the same kind of team dynamics virtually as you can in person. Yes, there can be some progress, right? You can do some of that. But I just think the true like proverbial like sit down, share a meal together, like connect the human in person like energy that is brought is just different. And so I'm a fan of like you just figure that out every year, like put it in the budget, plan it, like make sure that everyone gets to actually connect and meet, because the team dynamic on a board is important. It's amazing how we like bring on people like on our staff. We're like team building and how can we bring our staff team together as a united team? But we don't actually think about doing that for a board. And a board has to have trust with each other, just like a team does. And a board needs to be able to debate and have healthy conflict. And part of what makes that possible is like knowing who else is around the table. And so many boards, like I'll hear people get off the board and go, I really didn't hardly ever know anyone else on the board, what they did, like who they were as a person. And I just kind of go like, that feels unfortunate to me, like, because that's also some of the reasons sometimes people join boards is for that experience to get connected to other people who share a common vision for the mission. So that's of course first and foremost, but I always like to provide other ideas for those who don't have like the money, because budget is an issue. And I mean, I think it's not as good, but we've all seen there's so many that we saw it during the pandemic, right? Those like the things that you would do, like scavenger hunts online, like where you'd be in your house, so I have to go find something, or like icebreaker things. I mean, yes, you can do all that. What I like more, if you like actually have to try to really create sort of some unity, is like having board members. Like I would potentially do one virtual meeting where I'd say to board members, bring an object to share, like on our virtual meeting, that represents the way you think about this mission, or like that reminds you of our mission. And it's really that's fun in person, but it's also fun virtually. I've done it before, and like people get really creative, and it's just kind of another way to open it up. Or like here's a great read, like what can we share and talk about it as a group, like a little mini book club. Adding, maybe it's like you just add on a little bit of team building time couple of times a year or quarterly to virtual meetings, or however long you have them. And it doesn't even have to be that formal. Like maybe it's just like, hey, let's just get together and like hang out and just see how we're all doing. So you can do it virtually as well, but as you can hear probably by my tone of voice, I don't think that's quite as effective.
Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board. Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing. Nonprofit resources.
Welcome to Nonprofit Everything, the podcast where hosts Andy Shurick and Stacey Wedding answer your questions about all things nonprofit.
Welcome to another episode of Nonprofit Everything. I'm Andy Shurick. I'm here with Stacey Wedding. And we're here to answer nonprofit questions that you send us either by one of the social channels where we're at Nonprofit Everything, or if you go to nonprofiteverything.com, there is a question button that you can click, and that will send us a question directly there too. Or you can just email it to questions@nonprofiteverything.com. You really have no excuse to send us a question. So if you have one, there's like hundreds of ways that you can get it to us. Stacey and I, we've always complained that this part of the podcast is the part that we like the least, because it's less programmed, right? We're not reading a question and answering a question, which is like gets us to be able to use our scholar brains to be able to figure it out ahead of time and then answer it the right way. And this is more freeform, and we always feel like we're sort of flailing on this, but we've learned some new things. We've learned that Stacey doesn't like birds very much. We've learned that neither of us are good drivers for different reasons.
Well, they don't have, I don't think they know that story, Andy. So we were talking a little bit, just so you can have a sneak preview into our side conversations. We were like, we're both in really hot climates, right? I'm based in Vegas, Andy's in Phoenix area, and it has been a hot summer. And we were like saying it's really gotten to our tempers and our brains. And when we're driving, we're kind of angry drivers. So we are those people. Yeah. And the other day, I will say I was having this incident, Andy, where I was kind of spiraling out in the car and making hand gestures I shouldn't have made. And I was like, oh my, I had that quick minute thinking, what if that was someone I knew? What if that was like a client or like someone I loved and I'm sitting here just, so I need to get it under control. Yeah.
There's something about driving and being protected by a big steel box when you're going around that I think makes people like forget that they're actually interacting with other humans. I've always wondered that. It's like, well, what if that person got out of the car? Like, would you be so brave with your hand gestures?
Nope, absolutely not.
Right? So, I don't know, just be nicer to people. That's what we're going to talk about today, is being nice to people.
Oh, as we just started it out. So, okay, so my goal today, Andy, when we're done with the podcast, when I go out and I'm on the road, I'm going to just take some deep breaths, and I am not actually going to get upset. I'm going to zen out, and I'm just going to peace, love, and happiness.
There you go. So crank some Spice Girls on the radio, and it's impossible to be mad. I think that's the clue.
Here's a side story. So I'm just going to like open up I've already talked about the birds, and now I'll talk about this other side story because when I was in college, I remember my dad gave me as a gift for some holiday. It was like, have you ever seen those buttons? Like they have different buttons, like, and not like a button you wear, but like one of those like beeper buttons where you like press it down and like it might say something, right? Like, so he actually he gave me this beeper button where you could just touch it and it would like spout out like a kind of a dirty, like a dirty word or like a profanity. And he would say, instead of you doing that and using your mouth while you're driving to potentially get yourself shot and killed, I want you to put the beeper button like in your car holder and just like press it, but sit there like smiling while you're pressing it. And he goes, it'll still get that like that angst out about crazy drivers, but you can just like press the beeper button. And I did it for a while and it kind of helps. So maybe I need to find the beeper button again.
I love that idea. Your dad was a smart guy.
He was.
I'm the ED of a small nonprofit with several board committees. Recently, we run into issues with committee chairs no longer wanting to serve in those positions or rotating off the board with nobody else willing to fill their role. That leaves me stuck being the de facto committee chair until we find a new one. It's exhausting holding down the fort as both ED and having to lead a committee. Do we need a policy or something for dealing with absences in these types of positions, or is there something else you'd recommend?
Well, I don't think you should be the de facto committee chair. So let me just start with that. I mean, there's a reason you mentioned it. It's a board committee, right? It's a board standing committee. I'm assuming probably, it's one of those typical board committees, finance, governance, whatever, those kinds of committees. And no, I don't think you should be the de facto committee member. I think you might want to, on a micro scale, like, a very one solution could be having a vice chair, having committees that have sort of like you have the lead chair, but then you have the backup person, whether you want to call them a vice chair of the committee. I think that's just a matter of how formal you want to be. Or is there like someone who steps up and maybe it's an interim basis, just like you would do with anything else, right? Like in the interim to deal with what is on the committee's agenda. and you still play your typical role of a staff member supporting that committee. So if that's it, that's one solution. I don't know about a policy. I've never seen policies around something like this, but I think the larger question for me is just, is this a sign of a larger issue? Are the committees, like, if you're not getting people to step up, or people are rotating off of the board, which is natural transition, but then people aren't willing to step up. Why might that be? And I feel like that might be an interesting question to explore with the board as a whole, and for the board chair to really lead some of that conversation. Because if that's really an issue, like figuring that out will help resolve this down the road. Have you ever heard of a policy, Andy, around something like this?
No, not for committees. I mean, usually you have like a committee charter. I've seen lots of committee charters where it talks about like, this is the responsibility of the people that are on this committee, and this is what we're supposed to be working on. But I don't know that I've ever seen one that has like, if the committee chair can't do it, what happens next, or, that has any of that kind of stuff. And I'd be really hesitant to, I don't know, that just, to me, that feels like one of those projects that just takes forever. Like when you try to figure out, like, it's like changing bylaws, right? Yeah. You never want to do it because it just devolves into this conversation that nobody ever really pays that much attention to. But then people have little nitpicky things they need to worry about. It feels like it would turn into one of those kinds of things. I know, like, for me, I have had to like bribe board members to be on committees before. Where I'd take people to lunch and we'd have really long conversations about what we really need. And they'd go, yeah, I don't know that I have I don't have the knowledge for that, or I don't feel comfortable moving into that role. And you just have to kind of say, well, I'll just tell you what, I'll just like walk you through the whole thing. Like you don't really need to do a whole lot. You just need to, we have to have a treasurer. So, and that the treasurer is the person that's the chair of the finance committee. So we can't not have a treasurer, and you would be fine at it, and I will support you all the way. And, would finally get people to sort of reluctantly agree, okay, I guess I can do that role. And I think part of it is what the resistance is for a board member wanting to not do that, not wanting to be part of like leading a committee, is they've already feel like they've got a time commitment, and you're just adding to it. You're giving them more responsibility and more work. And they're like, already feel like they're overwhelmed with this, and they're not doing it. And they don't want to just do a bad job, right? I've only got like 2 hours for you a month. I don't want to do a bad job if all I've got is 2 hours a month. And so it's sort of contingent on you to make it easier for them to do their job. Like, say, this is what we need you for. I will spoon feed you everything you need, but you have to be the person that's nominally in charge of this. We can't have a staff member do it. And I think in this scenario, I would, especially if you've got nobody stepping up, but you still have a board, that would be a really, like, I think an important thing to say in a board meeting is staff can't run committees. Like, you can't have a staff person who's responsible for being the chair of a committee. It has to be a board member. So if we're going to continue to have this committee, we need somebody to run it. We need somebody to be the chair for it, or we're going to have to shut the committee down. And in some scenarios, you can't, right? You have to pretty much always have to have a finance committee. You probably should have an executive committee. You probably should have a nominating committee. Other committees, they can come and they can go. They're all, in my opinion, they're all kind of ad hoc. But yeah, I think, letting the board know that it's part of their board responsibilities to serve on a committee, and making that part of the thing that the board talks about is like their responsibilities as board members, is to know that as a board member, I'm expected to serve on a committee, and periodically I have to be the chair of a committee. You can't not do that.
I like that. And I think a lot of organizations have that as a requirement, that they have a committee structure, and that you have to at least participate in one committee. And the committees that work effectively, you see that oftentimes they like the committee work more than they do the board meetings, because the board meetings feel, when I hear people talk about it, they're like, it all boils down to the meeting, right? Like, and how productive they feel, and if they feel like it's a good use of their time. And how many times board meetings, if not done the right way, can just feel perfunctory and just, we have to do this, so we're just going to do all this report out, but like there's no actual discussion, dialogue, contribution. Whereas committees, you get to kind of roll up your sleeves and do some of the work. And the one thing I think I've noticed in committees I've worked with and clients I've worked with is that their committees oftentimes don't do a good job of simple things like, what are we trying to accomplish at this committee meeting? And then at the end, what are the action items? And then at the end, what are the key things we need to remember? So next time we convene, we're not like, what was it we were doing? Because I was just reminded of this the other day with a group. And I thought, gosh, they're doing great work when they're together, but they seem like they're all a little foggy on how far they got last time because no one's keeping minutes or notes of the meeting. And that's a problem. And then that starts to make you feel like you're wasting your time and spinning in circles. So I think sometimes that's why bringing that question up to the larger board, not only doing what you said, Andy, about like a staff member can't chair a committee, and so we need board members to step up, but also like the discussion of like, hey, here's what you should do at a bare minimum with your committees to make it a better experience. So it actually is a good experience for board members.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also, I know we've talked about this before. Some committees this works better for than others. So for a finance committee, there's a very specific set of activities that the finance committee is responsible for. And you can kind of put them on a calendar. So you have a calendar. If you have, say you have 4 committee meetings a year, the board has to approve the budget on a particular date, which means that the committee has to approve the budget before that date, or at least have seen it so that they can go through the details. So like, you'll know that your 3rd quarter board meeting is the budget meeting. And your 4th quarter, your 2nd quarter meeting is going to be a review of the audit findings, if there are any, or review of the audit. So you can sort of set those things on a recurring calendar that makes the meetings a little less loosey-goosey because like, here's what we have to do in this meeting. For nominating committee, I'm sure that's absolutely something you can do for a nominating committee. Yep. Executive committee, maybe not. If you have a governance committee or you've delegated that responsibility to another committee, I mean, those are things that who would ever want to be on a governance committee? I don't know, but you can put those things. You would? Like, I think it's quarter 3. We're looking at the bylaws again. Like, oh God, no. But it's another one that's very formal, and you can really come up with a calendar that you can follow. Because then it feels less wishy-washy to the chair. They don't feel like they have to like come up with the agenda and like do a whole bunch of work. They just need to make sure that they show up and they're sort of the board liaison for that topic. And so it's not really quite as hard as maybe they're imagining it to be. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And as much as you can kind of streamline, simplify, not reinvent the wheel feels like the recurring theme here as well. And also not having committee meetings that you don't need to have. I mean, Andy, how many times have you seen that where a group gets together because they think they are supposed to meet in between every board meeting, or the charter spells that out and the charter doesn't give them flexibility? And in some cases, maybe you do absolutely need to do that based on what you said, the schedule of activities the board needs to do throughout the year or vote on. But there's times where you go, don't meet. Like if there's nothing for the committee to be doing, don't like create stuff, right? Because I think that's also frustrating. You're like, what? Like we met for what?
Yeah. Especially if your board meetings are as frequent as monthly, like then a committee meeting just feels like suffering. Like, okay, now I'm dealing with you 2 times a month because I need to do a committee meeting for every board meeting. So yeah, take your committee's time responsibilities into consideration when you figure out what your schedule is. I'm a big proponent of quarterly board meetings if you can get away with it, because I mean, you lose some, the board members then completely forget what we talked about 3 months ago. So there's a lot of re-education that needs to happen where you're telling, okay, this is what we were talking about last time. But then it's not, you're not eating 6 hours or 8 hours a month out of every board meeting or every board member that they need to engage with your organization, which frankly could just be too much for them.
Yeah, I am sort of in the middle of what you're suggesting. I mean, I've seen quarterly work. Usually those should be longer board meetings if you're going to do that, because there's just more like substance. I mean, I don't mean like long, but like maybe they're a little longer because, but I also think it's I think monthly, it's very rare, unless maybe you're an all volunteer board or organization, maybe monthly then, because you're kind of you're wearing two hats. It's sort of some operational stuff and board stuff. So that might make more sense. But every month, I mean, when do you ever see that really needed? And the amount of work that staff puts into it is insane, like for board meetings. So any board members listening, please keep that in mind. You're killing your staff. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about the current debate around donor-advised funds.
So that's interesting. So for those of you that don't know what donor-advised funds are, or have heard of them but don't really necessarily know what that means. So what donor-advised funds are is a charity. So it's almost always a public charity who does nothing more usually than take donations from a donor and then hold the money until the initial donor gets to decide where they might want to ultimately deploy that money. So it's almost like an interim charity. And the initial pitch and the reason they work, or the reason that they exist, are basically the same thing that a community foundation does. And most community foundations behave just like donor-advised funds. They're sort of in the same universe where they pool the money. Theoretically, it can be invested. It's not a requirement that they be invested, but they can be put into the community foundation's accounts and then get invested. So over time, maybe that will grow. And then you can, put a little bit of money in there, and over time it grows, and then you can make a bigger, more impactful gift later. The benefits of them, really, other than that investment piece, are that when you make a gift as a donor, if you give it to the donor-advised fund, it counts as a charitable gift right then. So as soon as it goes, you get to take, if you're eligible for that kind of thing, you get to take that off your taxes, or take it out of the portion of your taxes that the charitable giving piece comes out of, right, before you start your taxes. So that's what it was designed for. And one of the issues that we've seen over time, and it's exactly the same issue that we see with regular foundations, is that once you put the money into the donor advised fund, there's no requirement necessarily that you do anything further. And that kind of goes against the intent of charitable giving, which is that the IRS is going to give you some sort of tax benefit for making a charitable gift. But if it's doing nothing other than sitting in an investment account and, in theory, making money for whoever's investing that for you, so lots of community foundations actually charge the donor money as part of that, as well as like an ongoing investment fee or an investment management fee. And so people are making money, people are getting tax benefits, and no charities are necessarily seeing, no charities that are doing program work are seeing the benefits. There's a bill that's going through Congress. That's actually some Treasury regulations that are being considered right now. I don't know that it's going anywhere. I think we're sort of in the stage of submitting public comments, or we're past the submitting public comments stage, which would, in theory, put some more guardrails on donor advised funds to make them a little bit more like private foundations, with requirements about having to give some money away over time and not necessarily letting it accumulate. Basically, there are ways that you can use a donor advised fund to basically avoid excise taxes on donations to individuals. So right now, if you wanted to send your kid to college, there's a loophole that you can use with a donor advised fund to be able to basically fund your own kid's scholarship with the university that you're sending them to and get a tax benefit for doing it, which is sort of contrary to what that in general, we don't necessarily want rich people to be able to use tax loopholes to send their kids to college. That just doesn't seem like what it's supposed to be intended to do. So there's some loopholes like that need to be closed. From a nonprofit perspective, like from a practitioner's perspective, there's not a whole lot we can do about this other than to sort of raise awareness of, we're glad that you're giving to charity, but we'd really prefer that that money be deployed into the community as it was intended and not just sitting on the balance sheet of a community foundation and having no further benefit to the community. Because the fact that the community foundation exists, sure, that's a benefit because it gives people an outlet to be able to make charitable gifts. But if they're not necessarily giving that money back out, if they're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, that seems like that kind of sort of defeats the purpose of charitable giving in general.
So I had an interesting conversation about this with someone I respect deeply and who is very philanthropic, because when kind of the legislation and sort of the debate about whether this makes sense or not came up, I had strong opinions. At first, I was like, yeah, like if you're going to put money, get an immediate charitable deduction, you should have to spend some degree of that money for the good of the community. Like that, you should be able to advise on where that money goes in a pretty short amount of time. And just theoretically, philosophically, what it's about, to do good for our communities. And this person really pushed back, but made me think about it in a different way. And so he shared, why should I be penalized? Maybe I want to endow my donor advised fund, right? Maybe I want to have it invested for the long term, last forever, and just a portion of it gets spent out. And maybe I don't want to even spend it. I want to have it build and grow for 10, 20 years or during my lifetime. And then after my lifetime, it's all given. And he's like, so why should I be penalized that I have to give out 5%, even though ultimately with the way community foundations and any of these other organizations that hold donor advised funds, right? Their fiduciary duty, their duty of like making sure donor advised funds, that it's going for charitable purposes, it will happen at some point. And so I thought he made a really good point, because I was like, I get that. Like for some of us, like we want to build our charitable pot. Maybe we don't want to spend it during our lifetime. And like, that should be okay. And so I'm in this really weird, now that like he really got me thinking and we had this healthy debate about it, I'm in this weird sort of place of tension about it, thinking, do we really have to spend, like, should we have to impose more regulations that force someone, the donor, who, again, is eventually that money's going to go to some kind of charitable cause or organization, like, but should we force them to force their hand to spend out a certain amount each year? And I mean, what I think we have an obligation to do is, as whatever the holding entity is for this donor advised fund, has an obligation to try to provide ideas, activities, ways to utilize that donor advised fund for good during the current times or during the lifetime. But some donors just don't want that. And should they be penalized? And I'm now leaning the other direction. What are your thoughts, Andy?
I mean, I think tax policy is probably beyond the scope of our podcast, because it's one of those things that's like, as soon as you start pulling one lever, something else changes someplace else. Like there's no, we can talk about one thing in a vacuum and sort of miss the forest for the trees. We've got, for example, like one of the biggest things that we've seen over time for when we look at nonprofits receiving funding is the estate tax. So when the estate tax goes up, nonprofits get more money because people are like, you know what? I'd rather give this money away to a nonprofit that I know of than have the government take it and do whatever the government's going to do with it, right? This is basic distrust of the tax dollars are being spent wisely. And then we see the estate tax, depending on the presidential administration or whoever's in charge of Congress, like it gets yanked and it disappears. And all of a sudden, as soon as the estate tax goes away, all that money dries up because they're like, oh, great, I don't have to give it. I'm not going to give it to the government, so I'm not going to give it to charities. So the philanthropic interest. What I would say is that we need to make sure that if we're giving people the warm, fuzzy feeling of giving to charity, you need to give. This is my opinion. If you're going to get the warm, fuzzy feeling of giving to charity, you need to actually give to charity. Like if you're trying to avoid tax by doing something that gives you some sort of benefit and you're just avoiding tax for the sake of avoiding tax, I think you're just probably a terrible person. Like this, because
Yeah,
if you're just,
I agree with that.
and I get it, and I think we see these things all the time, right? You got to make these ethical decisions about how you're going to do it. And if you don't believe that charities are working hard to help people in need or to make the world a better place, then don't give. And then find some other tax loophole to manage. Like, don't pretend that you're doing good things, with the, well, maybe one day somebody's going to come up with this really great charity idea and then I'll give all my money to that. I mean, I just think it's a convenient way of saying, well, I don't really intend to give it to charity anyway. I'll let my kids deal with it after I'm dead. And that thing can grow to $1 gazillion and, maybe somebody will be happy donating it later. I don't know. I do. And I don't want to say this, that donor advised funds are bad or that community foundations are a bad idea. I think it's a great idea. However, there needs to be some kind of personal requirement that if you're going to do this, you should have an idea about why you're putting the money into the donor advised fund and not just for tax purposes, which I think a lot of it is. I think a lot of it's just like, we'll just do this. And, some financial advisor goes, well, how much have you spent on your charitable giving this year? Oh, nothing. Okay. So if we take, $42,000 and we put it into this account, like we can then shave, $40,000 off your taxes. And it basically costs you $2,000 to save $40,000. Oh, yeah, let's do that, right? And then that's the end of the conversation. But so they're not thinking about it in a charitable way. They're thinking about it in a, let's just avoid tax way. I don't know. I find it, I don't know, it annoys me. It annoys me that the money that could be going is so baked into to tax policy that we're not talking about like how are we making things better. We're talking about how can we avoid taxes. It feels like it's the wrong conversation.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a fair point. And, and I know there's people who have benefited from the structure the way it is. I mean, when you think about, like we were talking about, one of the most contentious parts of it is the rule that, personal investment advisors, since a lot of institutions allow someone to bring in their own personal investment advisor to manage, those donor advised fund assets and that now would put that if this went through, those individuals would then become like considered the donor advisors and wouldn't be able to earn fees on it. And of course, they're in an uproar. And so, it does make you start to unpack like the system, the benefit, who's benefiting, like, is it really, are the charities benefiting? What is the benefit of all of it? And I think that I hate the fact that we have to regulate it. I think my wanting to see good in the world struggles with it because I don't ever think about things like that and think about, oh, let me get the immediate tax deduction and never like go and benefit anybody. Like, it's hard. That's like a really hard thing for me to like deal with. And when I worked at a community foundation, I don't feel like we had as much of that, like in general. And so I think it also is incumbent why I said like the institution that holds the donor advised fund, like be philosophically, ethically like inclined to try to get donors to spend some of that money to not just have it as a holding place. And so the argument back in the day, I mean, this was 20 some years ago that I was working at a community foundation, right? And the argument at the time for us was, hey, like, even if you let your money sit there, you're still benefiting. We're a 501c3 public charity. We do a lot of convenings and work for the good of the community. So even the fees we're earning off your money sitting there are still benefiting the community. And that was true and a fair statement. So like, I felt like okay with it under that pretense. But I don't know how we do it like without regulating it to a point there where we then like scare people away or not have them use donor advised funds. I think that's my part with this that gets me a little nervous is I don't want to see the vehicle, not that it'll go away, but I would just hate to see it be that everyone then just turns to some other kind of structure or, oh, let me just set up a private foundation. Because I actually think donor advised funds, when used well, can actually be an amazing charitable giving vehicle.
I absolutely don't disagree. It's one of those things I feel like I personally don't know a whole lot about football. And so like having a conversation with somebody about football is the same kind of like I know enough to like, well, I sort of know how the game is played and I know the names of the teams, but that's about it. So what we're really talking about is tax policy. And it's like, because the only reason a donor advised funds exists is because the IRS has decided that that's a legitimate way to avoid taxes. The same reason the 501c3 exists is a way to avoid taxes, which was then came out of like a whole bunch of for-profits complaining that they were unfairly competing with nonprofits. Like, so it's this really complicated lobbying effort by a whole bunch of different people who's made this big mess of spaghetti. And then we want to have like high-minded ethical conversations about whether or not this is a good idea. And there's no answer. There's no answer. So like, how do we, like, is regulation great? Probably not. But how do we talk to donors about like deploying money? For us, it's talking about like, look, we have something that we can do with your money that's going to create an instant good? If that's interesting to you, let's do that. If you're just interested in tax stuff, don't pretend like you're doing it for a good reason. Like, just say, yeah, it's a tax play, and then just leave it there.
We are so grateful to you for joining us for another episode of Nonprofit Everything. And if there's one key theme, I think, in all the episodes, it's that nonprofits are complex. And you know that when you listen to these questions, right? There's a lot that each of you are juggling out there, and a lot of different hats and perspectives and, different people you've got to help, influence or impact. And it's a lot. So I just want to say, like, thank you to what all of you do, for what all of you do each day, and for just like your commitment to the sector, because our sector needs you. And sometimes I don't think we say that enough to each other. So thank you to you for what you do. And thank you for what you do for us, like with these questions and with listening. So always curious to know if we could do something different, better, make it more fun, change up the format. So, drop us a note if that's the case. And again, you can find us at nonprofiteverything.com, and you click that big ol' ask a question button, or if you want to be a guest expert, you can do that too. And we've got all of that online at the website, or of course you can find us on social. So look forward to, being with you next time again in a couple weeks. Take care.